In Cleveland, Ohio, at the offices of our denomination, the United Church of Christ, at the national offices, there is a special sanctuary called the Amistad Chapel. Some of the materials used in creating this chapel are from the actual Spanish schooner from the early 1800s known as Amistad. And the entire space is designed to give one the feeling of being on a ship. There's a wooden pew on one side of the room with a tall back. And when you sit in that pew, you feel like you're in the hull of a ship. And you look out to the other side through a big window that overlooks downtown Cleveland. And it gives you the feeling of being held in a nice, secure place, while also feeling uncomfortably like you might be tossed out into the world at large at any moment. There's a gorgeous glass fixture on the ceiling, very similar to this bowl that we've enjoyed all summer with the water in it. It's light blue, and it's in these circles that fit within another. And there's all these lights that are spread across the ceiling. So when you look above, you feel simultaneously like you might be looking off a boat onto the water or looking above into the night sky. There are nautical shapes and symbols scattered throughout the entire sanctuary. And the communion table that stands sturdy right in the center of the space resembles nothing as much as it resembles a compass. The reason for this homage to the Amistad, for those of us who are unaware, is because it was our spiritual ancestors who supported the Mendi people who were prisoners on the Amistad. In the early 1800s, the Mendi people lived in Sierra Leone, and they were captured from their homes and taken to Cuba, where they were illegally sold into slavery aboard the Amistad. And when the Amistad was discovered by some American naval officers off the coast of Long Island, they found it adrift because the people aboard the Amistad, the Mendi people, had mutinied and murdered their captors. The American government went to trial against these prisoners, trying to make the case that they were not free people at all, but property. And since they belonged to the crew of the Amistad, they should be put to death for having murdered their owners. All along this lengthy trial that went from the local courts all the way to the Supreme Court, these men and women had no one on their side save a small group of abolitionists, which included Congregationalists from the local Congregational church and former President John Quincy Adams. And they continued to try the case all the way through the Supreme Court when they finally won the Mendi people their right to live and to be returned to their home. When you sit in the Amistad Chapel, you are reminded of this legacy. You are reminded of this story, and you can't help but absorb a very powerful and a very unsettling aspect of being human. Sometimes the world comes undone, and we are in desperate need of refuge. We tend to think of the story of Noah and Noah's Ark as this really nice story about a kindly old gentleman who starts the world's first petting zoo. And with all this magnificent diversity of animals, they cram them into this impossibly built boat, and they go on a month-long ocean cruise, and they sail around singing songs and being happy until they find the new dry land. And they go ashore, and every morning they wake up to rainbows for the rest of their lives. That's all part of the story, and it's an important part of the story. But it's not the reason we tell that story. The flood narrative, the flood story, has been told in every culture across humanity ever since the beginning. You can find records of a flood narrative in every single culture. And I don't believe the reason we tell that story in every single culture throughout all of human history is just because we like animals so very much. I think we continue to tell this story over and over again because it affirms an aspect of humanity that is so pervasive, that is so ever-present, we can scarcely bring ourselves to confess it. Sometimes the world becomes undone. Sometimes life as we know it, everything we have worked our entire lives to build and protect, to preserve and promote, everything we have come to depend on, just goes away. In 1839, a man in Sierra Leone named Sengbe had spent his entire life living with his people in his village. He had a wife, he had a child. He spent his days getting food for the family to eat. He spent his nights around a fire singing and playing games with his friends. Then, one ordinary day, he was clubbed over the head and forced onto a ship, and after a long time of being at sea, found himself having to protect his brothers and sisters and himself by taking human lives. He sat in prison and in court in a foreign land for months, having little to no idea of what the strange white people in all of their costumes were talking about, but feeling in his bones that his life depended on the outcome. His world had been completely undone, and he had no one save a small handful of dedicated and ordinary citizens to serve as his refuge. 15 years ago today, those of us who were alive then, it was a very normal Tuesday. I was in college, so I remember waking up that morning and heading off to my first class of the day, and I didn't even have a chance to notice that there were no other people outside before I saw someone I knew who was in tears, sobbing heavy, heavy tears. And I said to her, "What's wrong?" And she said to me, "You haven't heard?" And we spent the rest of that day watching images on the news of planes flying into towers. Everyone was scared. Everyone felt uncertain, and none more so than my friends who were from Brooklyn. The world as we knew it had been unmade right before our very eyes, and we clung to each other for refuge. This story that we read today comes really early on in this big book of ours. It's really soon after God creates the world. God separates everything and names it and calls it good. And not before long, violence and evil flood the planet. And so God decides to let the flood continue, to let the land roll back into the sea, to allow the sky and the ocean to become inseparable, to swallow everything back into wild and waste. Oh, but not Noah, not the last good man on earth. No, for him, God will provide instructions. And now in our Bible, we read that God says to Noah, build an ark. But if we were to read this story in the original Hebrew, we would actually read, God said to Noah, build Tevah. And the reason why this word Tevah is important is because it only appears twice in the entire Bible. It appears in this story and in another story in Exodus that was also about someone's life being ruined as they knew it. Pharaoh had sent out a decree that all the firstborn children of Hebrew slaves should be murdered because their numbers were growing so many. And a woman gave birth to her beautiful baby boy. And rather than being able to celebrate his existence, she put him in Tevah and floated him down the river so he would be sent to safety, where he was found and adopted by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter. When we see this word being used in these two occasions in the Bible, we can safely say that the word Tevah is something that preserves life. And this is what God promises. God promises for us, when everything comes undone, there will be something to preserve life. There will be something that can serve as refuge until the storm has passed. But friends, God does not just miraculously make Tevah out of thin air. It doesn't just show up for us one morning. God calls us to build Tevah, to build the refuge that shelters us during the storm. What the flood story reminds us is that our world will come undone when we are struck down by illness, when we are attacked, when we lose our jobs or we lose our way, when our loving relationships deteriorate, when we are exiled from our homes, when our way of life becomes unmanageable or unsustainable, when we are caught in open water, exposed to the elements, when our own laws threaten to strip people of their humanity, when a normal Tuesday turns out to be a day that you remember for the rest of your life, when the thing you thought could never happen happens. When this occurs, we are reminded God remembers us. God empowers us to build Tevah, to build something to preserve life for ourselves, for others. Tevah is not just an ark or a basket. It is a gift we are given so we can share it, so we can encounter neighbors and friends and family who are in the middle of their own personal storms and offer refuge to them. Sanctuary is not just a building that was built once 300 years ago, where we visit occasionally. Sanctuary is a way of life that we carry with us. It is a gift that we have to offer. If we're willing to practice that way of life, if we're willing to create that space for ourselves and invite others in. In times of storm and struggle, we offer a place to sit, to cry, to talk, to laugh, to connect until the storm passes. This is why we are church, to help one another prepare to serve as refuge for the needy. Storms come and go, friends. But let us stand firm in our faith. Let us be open and responsive to what God calls each and every one of us to build, so that whatever the weather brings, we can weather it together. Amen.